In the Quran, the root of taqwa is used 258 times in 8 derived forms. The modern-day Arabic language has attributed various meanings ranging from righteous piety to prudent fear to precaution to whatever meaning that would fit their narrative. But let us now define taqwa through the Quran as its own dictionary, free from sectarian and the modern-day linguistic distortions.
Okay, so let's dive into one of the most important words in Islamic spirituality, taqwa. You've probably heard it translated as piety or righteousness. But what if that's not the whole story? What if those translations are actually missing something crucial? Well, in this explainer, we're going to go straight to the source, the Quran itself, to see what it has to say about what taqwa really is.
So when you hear that word piety, what pops into your head? For a lot of people, maybe even most of us, it's all about the things you can see, right? You know, the rituals, things like formal prayers, fasting during Ramadan, customs that have been passed down for ages. That's kind of the standard traditional understanding. But here's the big question, the one that this whole analysis is built on. What if that picture we all have in our heads isn't really what the Quran is talking about? What if the original meaning of taqwa wasn't so much about those outward rituals, but about something happening on the inside, something to do with our conscience and even our intellect? Now, to even begin to answer that, the source we're looking at says we have to do something a little bit radical. We have to be willing to set aside, just for a moment, this really powerful idea of tradition and majority rule. It's almost like, to hear what the text is actually saying, we first need to tune out the noise from the crowd. And I know what you might be thinking, because it's the first thing that comes to mind, right? Whoa, hold on a second. Billions of people have understood it this way for centuries. Doesn't that count for something? And look, that's a totally fair and logical question to ask. But believe it or not, the Quran itself seems to have a pretty surprising, almost counterintuitive answer to that. This verse here is basically a direct warning. It says, hey, don't just automatically assume that what the majority thinks is the truth. It suggests the crowd can actually get sidetracked by conjecture, which is just a fancy word for guesswork and assumptions, instead of sticking to what's clearly in the text. And right there, that's the bedrock for this entire analysis. The argument is simple. Truth isn't a popularity contest. It's not determined by how many people believe something or for how long they've believed it. It's found by going straight back to the original source and letting the book define its own terms. Okay, so with that foundation in place, let's actually do it. Let's get into the text itself and see how the Quran pieces together its own definition of taqwa, almost like it's using its own verses as the building blocks. So the source for examining points out that the Quran builds this definition around 5, you could say, core ideas. We're going to walk through them one by one. We'll see how taqwa is tied to getting guidance from the book, to moral integrity, to having clear judgment, to being truthful, and finally to standing against falsehood. All right, first up, this connection is made literally right at the beginning of the Quran's 2nd chapter. It says, the book is a guide for the muttaqeen. Now, muttaqeen is just the word for people who have taqwa. So, boom, right out of the gate, the text makes a direct link. If you want guidance, you go to the book. And the implication here is, well, it's pretty huge. Think about it. If the book is the guide for people with taqwa, then having taqwa must mean you're guarding yourself by following that guide, not by just automatically following customs or traditions you inherited, which might have come from somewhere else entirely. Okay, this next verse is, it's incredibly direct. It says flat out that righteousness isn't about the physical ritual of turning your face east or west for prayer. Instead, it says the truly righteous, the muttaqin again, are the ones who believe, who are committed, and this is the key part, who act with justice and charity. And this is just a perfect example of the source's main point. It's like the Quran itself is making a hard pivot here. It's shifting the focus away from just the physical ritual and anchoring the definition of taqwa squarely in ethics and morality. It becomes about integrity, upholding justice, keeping your word, taking care of people who need help.
So it gets even more interesting. This next verse introduces a really fascinating idea, a kind of a result of having taqwa. It says that if you practice it, God will grant you something called a furqan, a criterion. So, what on earth is a furqan?
Well, a furqan is basically the ability to see things clearly. It's the power to discern, to tell the difference between right and wrong, between what's true and what's false. So according to this, Taqwa isn't just about being a good person. It's also a mental and intellectual discipline. It actually sharpens your mind. It's a tool for clear thinking. And here's the final piece of the puzzle. This verse ties everything directly to the idea of truth. It makes a super clear equation. The people who bring truth and the people who stand by it, those are the people of Taqwa. The text is basically saying you can't have one without the other. They're totally inseparable. All right, so we've just walked through all these verses, building this case piece by piece. So where does that leave us? Let's zoom out and look at the complete picture that's starting to form. This new definition of piety, and see how it stacks up against the more traditional one. So here it is. This is the definition that the source argues comes directly from the text. Taqwa is a conscious self-restraint. But, and this is the kicker, it's not about restraining yourself from food or water. It's about restraining yourself from injustice, from falsehood, from corruption. And the way you do that is by holding on tight to what's clearly laid out in the book. And this chart, this really lays it all out, side by side. On one side, you've got what the source argues is the Quranic definition of taqwa. It's about conscious self-control, sticking to the book, truth, integrity, a kind of moral and intellectual vigilance. Then on the other side, you have things that are often associated with piety, but which the source says aren't the foundation of taqwa itself. Things like specific rituals, fasting from food, or just blindly following the majority or clerical opinions. You can see it's a massive shift in focus, from what you do on the outside to what's going on inside your mind and your conscience. And that leaves us with one last big, thought-provoking question to chew on. Look, the point of this explainer isn't to say this is right and that is wrong. It's simply to explore what the source material itself seems to be saying. So the question is, if a core idea like piety can look so different when you go back to the text, what does that tell us about how religious practices might change and evolve over hundreds or even thousands of years? What's the real relationship between a founding text and the traditions that later grow up around it? It's definitely something worth thinking about.